Dramatic aerial footage of Syrian cities, conflict zones, and refugee camps. The Syrian Civil War has been one of the most brutal and complex conflicts of the 21st century, reshaping not only Syria but the entire Middle East. In this video, we'll explore the origins of the war, its devastating impact, and the web of alliances that have turned it into an international battleground. Historical background and roots of the conflict. Pre-war Syria, old clips of Hafiz al-Assad, and peaceful protests in 2011. To understand the Syrian Civil War, we need to look back at the country's history. Syria was ruled by the Assad family for decades, starting with Hafiz al-Assad's rise to power in 1971. Under his rule, Syria became a highly centralized authoritarian state dominated by the minority Alawite sect. Bashar al-Assad's early days as president in 2000. When Bashar al-Assad inherited power in 2000 after his father's death, many hoped for political reforms, but the regime remained oppressive. By 2011, inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings across the region, peaceful protests erupted across Syria demanding more freedom and democracy. Peaceful protests in Dara, Homs, and Damascus in 2011. However, Assad's government responded to these peaceful demonstrations with brutal violence, triggering a nationwide uprising that quickly spiraled into a full-scale civil war. Escalation into civil war. Escalating violence in 2012 to 2013, Syrian army tanks, rebel groups forming the early phase of the war saw defections from the Syrian army, with rebel groups forming under the banner of the Free Syrian Army, FSA. As the violence intensified, entire cities like Homs and Aleppo became battlegrounds. Assad's forces brutally cracked down on opposition strongholds, leading to widespread destruction. Destroyed neighborhoods and images of displaced civilians. By 2013, the war had fragmented, with multiple groups fighting for control of the country, including Islamist militias, Kurdish forces, and extremist groups like ISIS. The conflict was no longer just a civil war, it had turned into a regional and global crisis. Major factions and their allies. Map showing territorial control by different factions: Assad regime, rebels, ISIS, Kurds, the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad. Russia has been the most crucial ally for Assad, providing military support, airstrikes, and diplomatic backing since 2015. Russian intervention shifted the balance of the war in Assad's favor. Iran has provided military advisors, equipment, and funding. Its proxy militia, Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, has fought alongside Syrian government forces. Hezbollah, backed by Iran, has sent thousands of fighters to support Assad, particularly in key battles near the Lebanese border. Russian airstrikes, Iranian military advisors, and Hezbollah forces in Syria initially formed by defected Syrian soldiers. The Free Syrian Army, FSA, was one of the early rebel groups. Over time, its influence has waned, and the rebel movement has fragmented. Groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, later known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and Ahrar al-Sham emerged as powerful Islamist factions fighting both Assad and ISIS. Turkey has supported certain rebel groups, particularly in northern Syria, to counter Kurdish forces and push back against Assad. Qatar and Saudi Arabia provided financial and logistical support to the rebels early in the war, though their involvement has decreased over time. Rebel fighters and Turkish military presence in northern Syria. Kurdish forces, SDF/YPG. The US supported the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, a Kurdish-led coalition, in their fight against ISIS. The SDF has been crucial in liberating territories in northern Syria, including the city of Raqqa, ISIS's de facto capital. A US-led coalition of Western nations provided air support and military assistance to the SDF in the battle against ISIS. Kurdish fighters and US airstrikes during anti-ISIS operations. ISIS, Islamic State. Initially, ISIS had no formal state allies but was able to control vast areas in Syria and Iraq by exploiting the chaos. The group declared a caliphate in 2014 and attracted foreign fighters from across the globe. ISIS Black Flags occupied territories in 2014, and counter-operations by coalition forces, international intervention and geopolitics. UN meetings, footage of US, Russian, and Turkish military operations. The Syrian Civil War became a proxy war involving global powers. The United States, Russia, Iran, and Turkey each pursued their own interests, backing various factions. Western powers, initially hesitant, later intervened with airstrikes, focusing primarily on combating ISIS, while Russia and Iran focused on propping up Assad's regime. Airstrikes, destruction, and discussions at the United Nations. Despite numerous peace talks, including Geneva and Astana processes, a political solution has remained elusive. Humanitarian crisis, refugee camps, bombed out cities, children affected by war. The Syrian Civil War has caused one of the worst humanitarian crises of our time. Over 5 lakh people have been killed, and more than 12 million, half of Syria's pre-war population, have been displaced, either internally or as refugees in neighboring countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Refugee camps, UNICEF reports, and civilians discussing the impact of war. Civilians have faced siege tactics, chemical attacks, and starvation, with the Assad regime accused of using chemical weapons multiple times throughout the conflict. Chemical attacks and international responses. Current situation, 2024. Syrian cities under partial reconstruction, ongoing clashes in Idlib. By 2024, Assad has regained control over most of Syria, but pockets of resistance remain, particularly in Idlib province, where rebels and Islamist factions continue to fight. The region remains a hotbed of violence, with Turkish forces maintaining a military presence in the north and Kurdish forces in the northeast. Ongoing fighting in Idlib, Russian-Turkish patrols in northern Syria. While ISIS has largely been defeated territorially, sleeper cells remain active, particularly in the desert regions of Syria, launching occasional attacks on both government and Kurdish forces. ISIS remnants and anti-terror operations. Future outlook and peace prospects. Peace talks, reconstruction efforts, and Syrian civilians returning to rebuilt areas. The future of Syria remains uncertain. While the Assad regime has consolidated power, the war has left deep scars across the country. Reconstruction efforts have been slow, and Syria remains divided along ethnic and political lines. With international powers still involved, the potential for renewed conflict remains. Hopeful visuals of peace efforts, footage of civilians rebuilding their homes. Peace in Syria may still be a long way off, but for millions of Syrians, the hope of a stable and unified future is worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. We have some amazing videos coming up, so stay tuned for more updates on global geopolitics. And make sure to hit the subscribe button for more.